Hello and welcome back to Metahumanism podcast. My name is Bogdan. If this is your first time joining me, I encourage you to go and view my introductory video, the very first episode, where I go into my biography a little bit, and you can find out where I'm coming from and what this channel is all about. It's about philosophy, but also the Ukrainian perspective. So today we will continue. In the past few episodes, I've been examining the philosophy of a Ukrainian Socrates, as he was called, Hryhoriy Skovoroda, and his philosophy of the heart, which was influenced by Neoplatonism, Stoicism, and the Orthodox Christianity of Eastern dominant in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. And so today I want to continue with that series by examining adding one more Ukrainian figure, historical and literary figure, into the mix, and comparing both Skovoroda and this new figure, which I will talk about in a minute, to Thomas Jefferson, who is well known as an American founder. So, so let's begin. The first part of today's episode will be about Ivan Kotliarevskyi and Ukrainian literature. So that's that other figure that I just mentioned. He is widely regarded as the founding father of modern Ukrainian literature in a way. His work made a very decisive shift from the use of Church Slavonic or even Russian in literary writing to the vernacular Ukrainian language and the modern version of Ukrainian language. And he played a crucial role in shaping the modern Ukrainian cultural identity during a time of oppressive imperial domination and cultural subordination, which was at the end of 18th and beginning of 19th century. So he was born in 1769 and lived until 1838. So just the time when the classicism and the Enlightenment gave way to the romanticism of the 19th century. And so he rests on that watershed historical moment. His life and legacy are best understood within the rich and often contradictory socioeconomic and cultural political landscape of that late 18th, early 19th century. Ukraine, specifically what is known sometimes as left bank Ukraine, and that's as Dnipro, the river of Dnipro, flows into the Black Sea from north to south. The left bank is on the left. If you're facing down to the Black Sea, left bank will be on the left and right bank on the right as the water flows in the river. But if you look at the map, it's reversed. So the part of Ukraine which is to the right, to the east of the river, is the left bank Ukraine, and the part of Ukraine which is to the west of the river is the right bank Ukraine. So it can be confusing sometimes for people so unfamiliar with the terminology. So because of as I mentioned in my previous episodes, Ukrainian territory was split between Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so part of all of left bank Ukraine was under Russian domination, and part of the right bank as well, but not all of it. So like one part of the territory, Western Ukraine, which is Galicia and Volhynia, these are ethnographic areas. They were not under Russian domination. But that's is not the focus of our discussion. So he came from the left bank Ukraine, from the Cossack officer family, starshina in Ukrainian, equivalent of an officer. He received a classical education and participated in both imperial service and Ukrainian cultural life. This is kind of a combination, which was common in those times, in that period, because of the political circumstances. He also was a member of Freemasonry, engaged with theater and his social standing, all of which contributed, all of these factors contributed to his nuanced role as a cultural modernizer within that overall colonial context of Russian Empire and Ukrainian subjugation. So just to go with a little bit more detail about his biography. So he was born on September 9th, 1769 in Poltava, which is in central eastern Ukraine, and that was just 5 years before his birth. It was when Catherine II, the Russian Empress, abolished the autonomous Cossack hetmanate, the autonomous the Cossack autonomy, self-rule, was completely abolished in 1764, and then for another decade in Zaporozhian Sich, where the Cossacks used to also live on the rapids of Dnipro River, was destroyed in 1770s. This was the period of when Kotlarevskyi was born and was growing up. His ancestry belonged, as I said, to the officer class of Cossack Starshina. There was a hereditary officer elite of this autonomy, hetmanate, as it came to be known subsequently. And by this time, this class of hereditary officer elite was absorbed partially into the Russian service nobility, or dvoryanstvo, as was known. So it was for this kind of class of people, Ukrainian elite. It was a liminal position. They were once leaders of this semi-autonomous Ukrainian state, almost. At one point, it was a state, and then it was subordinated. Were now completely subordinated to the imperial hierarchy, and which was increasingly being centralized and so on. So his his family, Ivan Kotliarevskyi's family, possibly owned some land and serfs, placing them in a kind of a class of petty nobility, but they didn't have any major wealth. They were not exceptionally rich or anything like that. So this kind of still their gentry class position gave Kotlarevskyi access to education and civic life. So it did open some doors for him, but it also exposed him to the contradictions of serving an empire that erased his native polity, right? The Cossacks' autonomy. So his education was between 1780 and 1789. He studied at the Poltava Theological Seminary, where he received a classical education. So, the classics, history, and the works of classical culture, ancient classics, rhetoric, theology, philosophy, fluent in Latin, and a strong foundation in literature, which was evident in later him becoming literary and culturally active. He absorbed also elements of Enlightenment, rationalism, and satire in his education, which influenced his preference for humor and moral critique over heavy-handed didacticism or treatises or some kind of that kind of literary work. So. In terms of military and civil service, he served in Russian military during the Napoleonic Wars. He served also from 1796 to 1808. This was the period of Russo-Turkish War, first of all, and then also Napoleonic campaigns. He took some part in those. He witnessed and experienced the imperial machinery, the military and the bureaucracy, and but also kind of exposed him to larger geopolitics, European geopolitics of the time. And later, after leaving the military, he worked in education and welfare administration in Poltava. in his native city, including overseeing a charitable institution for orphans. So this role kind of reinforced his reputation as a moral public figure and tied him to early efforts at public philanthropy and social reform. So that says something about who he was and what his perspective was. So I mentioned Freemasonry, and the Enlightenment circles, which in some ways were connected. Kotlarevskyi was reportedly a member of a Freemasonic lodge in Poltava, which was called Love for Truth, Любов к истине. And I mentioned this difference between two different words in Ukraine, pravda and istina. Pravda is more conventional and contingent kind of truth, and then istina is more eternal, more objective kind of truth. So Любов к истине and Love for Truth Lodge, which included many prominent Ukrainian and Russian cultural figures at the time. So Freemasonry was actually pretty popular at the turn of the century, 19th century, in the context of Russian Empire, and it was semi-clandestine. The ideas from from Germany spread out to the east, and it was a form of intellectual exchange, moral self-cultivation, and limited political critique, and seeking liberalization of oppressive and despotic regimes. And actually Catherine II was considered the enlightened despot, and there were certain examples of such rulers in Europe which were subscribed to the Enlightenment ideals but then were absolute rulers. So it was this uneasy combination, and in some historical perspective, Catherine II might be and is portrayed that way, but obviously from Ukrainian perspective it does not. It doesn't work that way, because it was time of when the autonomy was abolished, the serfdom was instituted, so it was a time of oppression. So that's the kind of this illusion of the Enlightenment being this pure, rational system of ideas that, without any contradiction, was immediately obvious from the Ukrainian perspective, as it may not have been from the more Western European perspective, and the illusion that the Enlightenment has the answer or the panacea for all social ills and problems in society. We'll come back to that point. So he was not, so this Freemasonry within Russian context, it was not exactly politically radical per se, but these lodges did promote humanist ethics, cosmopolitan ideals, mutual aid, and helped circulate Enlightenment values in the conditions of overall censorship from the imperial powers. In the early 19th century, actually, after the Decembrist attempt, Decembrists in 1825 to overthrow the monarchy and install a different monarch, because of the crackdown, Freemasonry was pretty much extinguished in the 19th century. But at this point, it was pretty popular. So his involvement in Freemasonry suggests that he had access to trans-imperial networks, European intellectual networks that functioned horizontally across empires and different polities, and the cosmopolitan ideas that went along with it, the free exchange of ideas. He also was committed to moral improvement, human dignity, social critique, although within somewhat conservative network. So Freemasonry doesn't fit very neatly into modern categories of liberal versus conservative, so it was a little bit of both, progressive or retrograde. So participation in this prototypical civil society in imperial Ukraine, where such informal association could incubate cultural autonomy, was also an important aspect of Kotlarevskyi, what influenced Kotlarevskyi. Next aspect is his cultural involvement. So Besides his civic position and working with the orphans and advocating for certain reforms, his experience with the military, he became involved very deeply with the local cultural scene. He helped. I will just go through the major contributions of his to Ukrainian culture and cultural activities overall. So first of all, first and foremost, he's the author of a work called Eneїda. He wrote it in 1798, and it was a travesty, or which is a literary genre, a mock epic poem loosely based on Virgil's Aeneid, right, on the founding of Rome, the Trojan War, and the founding of Rome, that epic. But this was a satirical work. It was directed as a criticism against the imperial culture, and was written in a vernacular Ukrainian language of the time. This was the first major literary work written in that vernacular. So that's the significance of this. It was a verse epic, but. And that's the significance of this work of literature. So the story is reimagining the Trojan heroes as Zaporozhian Cossacks, and they use humor, satire, and folk idiom to reflect Ukrainian life, language, and identity in that work. And it did basically, the great parallel to draw is that Eneїda did for Ukrainian culture and identity what Dante's Divine Comedy did for the Italian identity a few centuries before that. It legitimized the vernacular as a literary language. Language and national identity. So that's the second contribution, is that his work, while it was humorous and it wasn't really, in a sense, serious or intended to be politically engaging or anything like that, it was mostly focused on the cultural aspect. It's still, because it used spoken Ukrainian, rich in local idiom, proverbs, humor, folk culture of Ukrainian nationality, it helped create this version of modern Ukrainian language and valorize the Ukrainian language and elevate it into the status of almost high literature. There will be a caveat which I will mention subsequently, but and it was as distinct from the Church Slavonic, which was official clerical language, and from Russian imperial domination. So he demonstrated that Ukrainian could be a vehicle for high literature, not just folklore or peasant speech, right? So that's he didn't go all the way to more serious, quote unquote, genre like drama or tragedy or so on, but this was already a big step forward. A revival, third contribution is his revival of this Cossack mythology and images. It also played an important role. It kind of portrayed Cossacks as heroes who were, participated in the war, in the Trojan War in this context, and then they were on this journey to found a new city or Rome, the original. And so, but he portrayed them, their life and conversations and adventures by drawing on Ukrainian folk life. And so that he resurrected the memory of the Cossack glory and Zaporozhian siege, which was ruined by the time this was written. And so it's kind of rejuvenated this Cossack myth and became a symbol of freedom and resistance. And this laid a groundwork for future generations of literary figures and cultural activists, and romantic in the tradition of romantic nationalism of 19th century, like Taras Shevchenko, Panteleimon Kulish, Mykola Kostomarov, and others, which worked more towards the middle of 19th century, the next generation. And finally, he was a pioneer of Ukrainian theater. He in 1818 he co-founded the first professional Ukrainian language theater in Poltava, demonstrating his commitment to public education through art. Right. So, as in ancient Greek times, tragedy and drama and comedy were considered important for public education. For processing complex emotions through catharsis and so on. The same as here. That's he wrote a couple of very famous plays that are being staged to this day. So two of them are Natalka Poltavka, which means Natalka is a name that comes from Poltava. He wrote that in 1819, and then Moskal Charivnik, which means the Muscovite sorcerer. In translation, he wrote it around the same time, and both of them were performed in Poltava and became classics of the Ukrainian drama. As I said, still staged to this day, and with modern rethinking and adaptation. And they portrayed Ukrainian life and folk types realistically, and combined romantic sentiments and romantic adventures with satire, with moral clarity and criticism, and so on. So this also, in addition to his literary work, Eneїда, this reinforced the legitimacy of Ukrainian as a performative and public language, accessible and powerful enough to express moral, social, and emotional life of Ukrainian people. The theater became a vehicle for this vernacular expression in a condition of oppression and censorship, and it was a way to preserve culture and start forming modern national identity. And so finally, in terms of his biography, he died in November 10 of 1838 in Poltava, and he buried there as well. And his tomb afterwards became a site of cultural memory for this emerging Ukrainian national movement. And in a minute, I will also talk about his monument was installed in Poltava in 1903, and it became a huge defining event in the history of Ukrainian movement, and I will talk about it in a minute. So, some of the limitations about of his worldview was he was not a radical revolutionary. He wasn't a political radical. His works did not, as I said, they were kind of travesty, humor, satire. Did not directly advocate any political independence or social upheaval, but it was a form of resistance within the system, cultural resistance at least, and it laid the groundwork for future efforts for liberation. So his celebration of common life, folklore, critique of social absurdities, emphasis on dignity, were kind of quietly subversive in terms of contemporary conditions at the time of imperial cultural efforts to assimilate Ukrainians into the Russian Empire. He remained loyal to these Enlightenment ideas of virtue, reason, cultural elevation, and moral clarity. But did it in a humorous, folkloric way, with a sense of kind of civic duty and responsibility. But again, this foundation of Ukrainian literature in a humorous tone, in some ways, in one way was subversive and resistant to the empire, but in other ways, it contributed to this tradition of lack of seriousness. Maybe some critics later would regret that Ukrainian literature was founded with this kind of a joke as a founding move, because it kind of the future generations kind of took that signal and followed that lead, and it took a little while to overcome that legacy of humorousness and become a little bit more serious about literature and move from cultural perspective to more political engagement. So there is that criticism. Just wanted to point that out. But he's still a foundational figure. He did redefine Ukrainian identity in a period when political institutions had been erased, and so there was danger of greater erasure, cultural erasure. But he did his activities did not allow that to happen. So that's why he became a symbol and a founding figure. He made Ukrainian culture and language visible, audible, and joyful in the context of repression and censorship. So, so this, as I said, he influenced future romantic generation of romantic nationalists and more nationally minded and politically radical thinkers and activists. Now, what I promised you to tell you about in 1903 is when the Ivan Kotliarevskyi monument in Poltava was being unveiled, and it became a huge cultural and political event in terms of Ukrainian national movement, because it was the first monument to a Ukrainian writer, first public statue to be erected in honor of any Ukrainian writer. So there was a huge event, and a lot of Ukrainian elite, kind of intelligentsia or highly educated elites, people of letters, both men and women, gathered in Poltava to commemorate this kind of watershed moment. And it was funded this monument was funded largely by community, a local community, and Ukrainian activists, and unveiled in September of 1903. So, and this was against the Russian imperial attempts to undermine and sabotage this event, and control and censor it. So this is just to give you an example of who was present at the event. Some of the key figures were Ivan Franko, which I mentioned him in one of the early episodes. He was a writer, philosopher, political thinker, politician also even, and he kind of helped condense and formulate the Ukrainian political national idea. He was from Western Ukraine. He was not under Russian subject, so he was kind of that's a symbol of that event, that it united the educated elites from both parts of Ukraine, which were ruled by different empires. Lesia Ukrainka is a very prominent figure in Ukrainian history and literature. She was a poet, a playwright, a symbol of Ukrainian modernism, feminism, and resistance. She was from within Russian-dominated part of Ukraine, and so this I will explain why that makes a difference. Not just the unity, but there was a different treatment of these two categories of people by the Russian Empire itself. Then there was Mikhailo Kotyubinsky, also another prominent prose writer known for psychological realism. Boris Hrynchenko, public intellectual, linguist, compiler of one of the first Ukrainian dictionaries. Panas Mirny, Volodymyr Samilenko, Olena Pchilka. She was Lesia Ukrainka's mother. That was her pen name, Olena Pchilka. She was from the family of Dragomanovi, and Dragomanov was also one of the philosophers and political thinkers, anarchist, kind of mutual aid, socialist thinkers in the middle and second half of 19th century. Dmitro Yavornitsky and others. I will not go into details about each of them, but basically these all figures represented a very broad cross-section of the Ukrainian intellectual front, from central Ukraine, which was under Russian Empire, and from Galicia or western Ukraine under Austro-Hungarian rule at the time. So the latter, the western part of Ukraine, had more cultural freedom within Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so their presence was important and emphasized all Ukrainian character of the event. And the way Russian Empire tried to crack down on this event, those from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they weren't able to control them, so they were able to speak in Ukrainian, no problem. But anybody who was subject of the Russian Empire was prohibited from speaking Ukrainian officially. They viewed this cultural nationalism as a threat to imperial unity, and was very wary of any public celebration of Ukrainian national culture. So at that time, the Ems Ukaz of decree of 1876, which prohibited all works, all published printed works in Ukrainian language, was still in effect. So the oppression, the cultural oppression, was full force. It was before the 1905 kind of liberalization and establishment of the parliament. So this was preceding that moment. And the authorities attempted to restrict or censor the event. Actually, there was very heavy police presence. There was a heavy surveillance of known Ukrainian activists who lived in the Russian Empire. Some figures weren't even were warned not to speak, or text of the speeches had to be pre-approved. Banners or Ukrainian symbols, nationalist symbols, were prohibited or discouraged at least. Public displays of Ukrainian identity were discouraged also, or monitored very closely, like embroidered shirt, language, Ukrainian symbols. And and as I said, speeches were to be made only in Russian. But despite this attempt to crack down, many participants defied and resisted this censorship, and they spoke and sang in Ukrainian, which has kind of created this atmosphere of protest a little bit. So many of the speeches were very emphatic and very kind of emotional, emphasized Kotlarevskyi's symbol as a symbol of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language, freedom, cultural autonomy, dignity. And one of the participants, reportedly at least, said that we are not unveiling a monument to a mere writer, we are unveiling a monument to our awakening. And so it was kind of a literary tribute coded over like as a national protest, as a statement of distinct culture that has its own existence. And most poignant moment probably was Lesia Ukrainka's performance, a speech where she recited her poem Contra spem spero. From Latin it means I hope against the hope. Again, her views, her personal political views, were socialist, feminist, and also strongly anti-imperial. She was known. She was highly respected as a writer, as a poet, as a dramatist, but she was also gravely ill with tuberculosis, which added poignancy to the moment because of her appearance. She didn't look healthy, unfortunately. But this was when she recited this poem in Ukrainian. There was an open act of defiance and a personal political statement of resistance, resilience, and existential courage. So especially the two lines I will quote is «Без надії так і сподіваюсь, буду жити, геть думи сумні. Without hope, I still hope, I will live on, away with sorrowful thoughts». So that was the message. This became a motto of cultural resistance, and people remember that moment and then recalled it in their memoirs later and recollections, and so this was a defining moment for many. Later on in the press, the imperial press tried to downplay all of the significance of the event, framed it as just a regional cultural celebration. But the Western Ukrainian papers, on the other hand, like literary and scientific Herald, for example, Literatурно-науковий вісник, published detailed and sympathetic coverage describing the events and everything that transpired there, praising this resistance and cultural pride and dignity. There was a backlash, obviously, after the event. Those who lived in the Russian Empire were, again, surveilled and persecuted to some extent, censored in some instances. But the authorities clearly realized that Kotliarevskyi's legacy and Ukrainian national culture could not be repressed and neutralized, as they might have believed before then. So legacy, it became a symbolic, uniting and turning point for Ukrainian national movement, and the politicizing radicalization of that movement. And it was kind of a protest of taking cultural identity and moving into the political realm and against and protesting colonial repression. And the monument still stands to this day as a key symbol of Ukrainian cultural heritage, and as Russia attacks Ukraine again and trying to erase its existence. Next, what I want to do is I want to compare. So there's just a quick comparison of Kotlarevskyi to put him in context now with certain figures in other European nationalities or ethnicities. There's not exact correlation or parallel, but there's echoes. So analogies and kind of counterparts of his role for Ukrainian, we can highlight certain historical figures in other cultures. For example, Carlo Goldoni in Italy, similar role in reforming national theater and language, for example. He used vernacular Italian and more specifically Venetian dialect to elevate popular life, moving away from the formalism of commedia dell'arte, which the tradition that existed. And like Kotlarevskyi, he combined humor, moral satire, and cultural realism, making theater more democratic and reflective of everyday people, Italian people. So both of them contributed to nationalization of language through the stage. And as we know, Italy was not united at that point. So there was also a matter of national unification and formation of a modern identity for Italy. In German context, we can talk about Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, well-known classical figure of Enlightenment dramatist, thinker, literary reformer. He advocated for rational religion, tolerance, vernacular literature in a culturally fragmented German context. As we know, Germany was also not united at the time. Was still kind of feudalistic in small mini states, and Holy Roman Empire, which was destroyed in the Napoleonic Wars and reformed in other shapes and forms. Like Kotlarevskyi, Lessing fought against dogma through satire and saw the stage as a tool for moral education. So there's a parallel there. Both mediated between elite Enlightenment values and vernacular cultural expression. So you can see it's certain, I'm highlighting specifically those cases within European context, which are most similar to Ukrainian context in Kotlarevskyi. Another example could be Ignacy Krasicki from Poland, Lithuania. So before it was partitioned by Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Prussian Empire in the late 18th century. So he was Enlightenment era poet and satirist. He used humor, fables, and didactic verse as well to criticize corruption and backwardness in society, which was under threat of partition and foreign domination. Right. So that's the context, which is in many ways similar to Ukrainian. And like Kotlarevskyi, he walked this tightrope between Enlightenment critique and patriotic cultural affirmation under conditions of political decline and imperial encroachment. So very similar contexts, probably the most similar out of the three I already mentioned. We can mention Leandro Fernández de Moratin in Spain. He reformed Spanish theater in the late 18th century using vernacular language of Spain, bourgeois values, Enlightenment critique of superstition and ignorance. He used comedy and popular genre to embody Enlightenment values in the cultural specific vernacular and idiom of his land. And he also, just like Kotlarevskyi, worked within constraints of the political environment he was part of, and used theater as a space to quietly reform things or move things forward. And then not a very exact analogy, but again, back to the German and Baltic context. Johann Gottfried Herder was not a literary person. He was more a philosopher, and he worked in language philosophy, folk culture, national identity. But he was important in Eastern European context because he was within the Baltic German community. He came from that community. He saw language as the soul of the people and promoted folk traditions, and his perspective was kind of contributed to the rise of Romanticism and nationalism in the 19th century. An emphasis on self-determination, cultural autonomy, dignity, so both figures emphasized the people, in Ukraine, narod, in Germany, folk. So this kind of moral cultural agents in the face of bureaucracy, empire, and attempts to assimilate and homogenize the population. But what makes Kotlarevskyi unique in this context is that while his counterparts in Europe often worked within emerging national states or culturally fragmented but autonomous regions, Kotlarevskyi operated under a foreign empire that explicitly dismantled the political institutions of his native land, banned its language from official use, and erased political memory. That's what happened during the 18th century. So while these figures I just mentioned, Goldoni reformed Italian culture from within the Italian-speaking context, Herder and Lessing worked from within German culture umbrella. Krasicki, even in terms of Polish, he mourned the loss of Polish sovereignty. But Kotlarevskyi, he created his modern cultural tradition out of the ashes, in a way, of political obliteration with little or to no institutional support. So that's what makes his case a little bit unique, more unique than these other cases I mentioned. He was combined. Kotlarevskyi can be seen. He's to Ukrainian culture and literature and history. He played a role like Goldoni played in Italian theater, like Lessing played in German Enlightenment drama, and Herder in terms of romantic nationalism. But he did it all within the imperial context, in the context of repressions, domination by Russian culture, and censorship. So that's added kind of dimension to consider. So next. Now we get to the point where I want to compare Kotlarevskyi, Skovoroda, and Thomas Jefferson. So first, this comparison, because Thomas Jefferson, just to compare, Kotlarevskyi lived 1769 to 1838, Thomas Jefferson 1743 to 1826. So roughly similar periods. Skovoroda lived earlier, 1722 to 1795. So he was kind of a generation before, but they still overlapped, and so it's a fruitful comparison to draw out distinctions and similarities. So they emerged from so all three figures really, even though Kotlarevskyi and Skovoroda belong in the same national context, they emerged from different contexts, and they made different choices and led very different lives. There's still enough similarity among them to draw out fascinating parallels and contrasts. They were all in some ways products of the Enlightenment environment, even if in different ways, which I will examine in a minute. And the difference was that they filtered this Enlightenment thought through different lenses, civilizational. Jefferson, obviously through Anglo-American liberal republicanism, Kotlarevskyi through the hybridized Cossack Baroque culture, which he was modernizing, also Slavic Orthodox context, and the Russian imperial environment of left bank Ukraine or Russian dominated Ukraine. And Hryhoriy Skovoroda also through similar cultural context as Kotlarevskyi, but he took a very different, radically different path that critiqued rationalist universalism fundamentally and liberal individualism, and offering a unique synthesis grounded in mysticism, inner freedom, and symbolic wisdom. So just a very different perspective to the. He lived in the Enlightenment times, but synthesized a very distinct philosophical perspective. Just to draw a comparison, I will go through several aspects of their thought and activities, and summarize a little bit about each of the three figures: Jefferson, Kotliarevskyi, and Skovoroda. So, Enlightenment influence for Jefferson, he was steeped in John Locke's Lockean liberalism, French rationalism, the French Enlightenment philosophers, and Scottish moral philosophy like Hume, Adam Smith, and so on. He emphasized reason, individual rights, progress, and secular education. Advocated freedom of religion, scientific inquiry, education reform, agrarian democracy. So that was his perspective. Kotlarevskyi was influenced by late Baroque Orthodox scholasticism in his education, some Latin classics as well, and filtered in Enlightenment thought through clerical and Freemasonic networks in Ukraine. So it was not as pure liberalism and rationalism of the Enlightenment as Jefferson. In a way, advocated or slightly less or more mediated through other traditions. He still advocated moral virtue, popular dignity, vernacular cultural revival, civic engagement, though he was less systematic in ideology. He was not a philosopher, he was more of a literary, theatrical figure. Skovoroda was influenced more by esoteric Neoplatonism, ethical Stoicism, and the Orthodox Christian contemplative tradition of hesychasm, which I discussed in previous episodes, and not as much by the transparent rationalism of the Enlightenment directly, so he synthesized his influences into a unique philosophical perspective centered on inner freedom, reflection, and ethical freedom and reflection, and then ethical and mystical harmony with one's true divine nature, srodnost, which I mentioned in previous episodes. In terms of language and literature, Jefferson was a master of formal prose. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, many legal and political texts, extensive letters. He's well known for his eloquence and political speeches. His language, he used it to articulate Republican political philosophy, promoted the classical canon and translation of Greco-Roman works in his life. Kotlarevskyi, he was a master of vernacular poetic expression, as I already discussed. He created a Ukrainian literary language through satire, humor, and epic parody. Language used to dignify the folklore, the folk life, challenge elitist cultural norms, and mock imperial pretensions. He recast Virgil's Eneїda in Ukrainian Cossack tradition, as I mentioned, Cossack idiom and vernacular, and practices, life habits of life, and the subversive act of cultural appropriation and reinvention. Right, Greek Virgil's Eneїda, Roman epic, was reappropriated. Skovoroda, he also used Ukrainian vernacular poetics, but more Baroque style. He more focused on symbolism. He expressed through allegorical dialogues and parables, He drew on Plato, Stoicism, scripture, folk motifs and songs, and rural wisdom. He was deeply non-academic, accessible, culturally rooted, resonant with Eastern Orthodox spirituality. In terms of public service and civic life, Jefferson, obviously, as we all know, he held high political offices: governor, secretary of state, vice president, president. He was the architect of early U.S. policy in all dimensions, founded the University of Virginia, supported public education, and so on and so on. Kotliarevskyi never held a high state office in the empire, but he served as a military officer, educator, theater director, charity organizer, civic leader in Poltava. So he had some experience at a certain level as a leader, civic and political leader, directed the Poltava theater, worked with charitable institutions, and influenced civic culture in his region. Skovoroda was largely anti-political in a classical cynic and Christian sense. He chose this inner republic of the heart over external revolutions or external glory or imperial career and so on, or church career. Skovoroda saw politics as a distraction from the true transformation of the soul. In terms of empire and national identity, Jefferson was a founder of a new sovereign republic, obviously paradoxically a slaveholder who advocated for liberty, but anti-imperial in terms of rebelling against the British Empire, deeply involved in building national identity in the US. Political and national identity was rooted in independence, so in those terms, radical in some ways thinker. And democratic thinker. Kotlarevskyi, a Republican. Kotlarevskyi was a subject of the Russian Empire, and he did not advocate for any radical political changes, but he did advocate for cultural autonomy of Ukrainian cultural autonomy within this repressive environment of imperial structures. He almost inadvertently founded the modern Ukrainian literary and linguistic tradition by writing Eneїda. Cultural and national identity was rooted in vernacular, revival, and resistance. So that was his role. And Skovoroda, he refused to participate in the practices of institutional authority at all, choosing to become a wandering philosopher rather than continue to teach in academia. Life was his message. Inner self as the side of truth, right? So know yourself, Ukrainian Socrates, becomes a de-imperializing act. Inner freedom from any external power, any dogma, any identity imposed from without. Skovoroda was a counter-imperial metaphysician, one might say, not a romantic nationalist. So it needs to be said clearly. He was not a nationalist in his thinking or politically active, but he created this unique synthesis, intellectual philosophical synthesis, kind of a mystical realism. Philosophy is the path of the heart in his mind, and truth is the lived experience, and human being is the temple where God speaks, to put it poetically. So this was already in a way counter anti-imperial and subversive and radical, in formulating this philosophical synthesis. In terms of Freemasonry and ethics, just to come back, Jefferson, as we know, many founders at that time, those ideas were popular in those societies. Jefferson was sympathetic to Freemasonry's deist, rationalist, and humanist ideals, morally driven by Enlightenment ethics towards virtue, reason, and liberty. Kotlarevskyi was active, as I said, in the Ukrainian Freemasonic circles, embraced ethical cosmopolitanism, moral reform, human dignity. He was kind of morally driven by ethical satire, folk wisdom, Christian ethics, and civic compassion in his life. Skovoroda, a philosopher, a poet, and a composer, he was often associated, as I said, with mystical and esoteric traditions. There's no definitive proof that he actually belonged to any Masonic lodge himself, but his philosophy aligns with certain Masonic ideals of self-knowledge, enlightenment, and moral perfection. Enlightenment in the broad sense, not specifically the Enlightenment movement. According to his close friend and later biographer, Skovoroda actually disapproved of the confidentiality of Freemasonry, its secret practices, because he thought that moral goals should be out in the open. He was against the magical and alchemical practices that were also part of those circles of Freemasonry and mysticism. But his position was not categorical, and the Freemasons themselves actually were sympathetic to Skovoroda and his philosophical mysticism. So there's some affinity there, which is also an interesting dimension to explore. Key contrasts, just to highlight them again. In terms of political power, Jefferson was an architect of a nation. Kotliarevskyi was a cultural pioneer under empire. Skovoroda was anti-political, refused and resisted political power. Philosophical system, Jefferson was rationalist and systematic thinker. Kotlarevskyi was intuitive, literary moralist, not so much a systematic thinker or a philosopher. Skovoroda was esoteric, mystical, contemplative, rationalist, but in a Stoic and Platonic sense, not in the Enlightenment 18th century sense. In terms of language, Jefferson was classical, abstract language of the rites. Kotliarevskyi, earthy, popular, carnivalesque style, and Skovoroda, allegorical, parabolic, and folkloric wisdom. Relation to people, Jefferson was a member of landed elite, speaking for the people, quote unquote. Kotliarevskyi also was an emergent national subject within the foreign empire, in a way, voicing the concerns of the folk, the nation, the narod, the nationality, the people. And Skovoroda also came out of the privileged, was background, was all highly educated. So he was kind of a highly educated sage who made a moral choice, ethical choice to live among the people and be one of them. In terms of impact, Jefferson obviously left a global political legacy by founding the United States, helping found the United States. Kotliarevskyi was foundational for Ukrainian cultural identity, so important in that sense. Skovoroda, founder of the modern Ukrainian intellectual and philosophical tradition. So both extremely important to Ukrainian identity and have something to contribute to global thought. And it just hasn't been discovered yet because of the imperialism. So, in summary, Thomas Jefferson represents the kind of architectonic, if you will, Enlightenment, systematic, political, institutional, and outwardly universalist. Ivan Kotliarevskyi represents the vernacular Enlightenment, ironic, ethical, embedded in cultural resistance, and emerging identity. So slightly different emphases. Because of the different context. Hryhoriy Skovoroda represents spiritual anarchism and inner mysticism, one might say, more aligned with Eastern Christian wisdom and Socratic cynic ethics than with Enlightenment secularism or Jeffersonian liberalism. And the reason for both Kotliarevskyi and Skovoroda being different is that they were in the working, thinking, and living in the context of imperial oppression. So the institutions and the official culture was seen as oppressive. Jefferson was not working or writing or living or acting in that kind of context. He lived in the context of freedom, and they just obviously rebelled against the king who was trying to impose his rule, but still, in terms of language and culture, they were the dominant English Anglo-Saxon culture, Protestant culture, and so on. He was not working under the oppression as both Skovoroda and Kotliarevskyi were working. So this is a very important distinction and partly explains their differences. They could not associate the Enlightenment with the official institutions or the politics because it was not accessible to them, and their realities were very different. And that's why Skovoroda there's a little bit of a counter-enlightenment in his thought, because of his philosophical influences and because of this dimension of the Enlightenment being associated with the imperial institutions in some ways. So this is an important aspect to highlight. They would obviously never would be able to know each other, even Kotlarevskyi and Skovoroda, different generations, but they all three stand at the hinge of modernity, transposing these classical legacies into new languages of peoplehood, ethics, nationality, civic imagination. And Jefferson did it through political theory, Kotlarevskyi through his verse and theater, and Skovoroda through his philosophy of the heart and ethical harmony with one's inner nature. That is it for today. There's still one more dimension I want to explore, and I will have to, just for the sake of time, I will record a separate episode focusing on that, where I want to expressly compare the more philosophical, from a more philosophical perspective, Skovoroda, the Enlightenment, and Thomas Jefferson as a third point of comparison, America, so the European Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment, and compare the three in a more philosophical manner. And that will be the next episode. So hopefully see some of you. Well, I won't see you, but hopefully you will be there and listen to me. Thank you for being here. And as always, please support Ukraine if you are not supporting Ukraine yet. I always include information about how you can do so in all my posts and videos, in description to my videos. So please consider supporting Ukraine in any way you can. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.